This is Breathe California TV. My name is Terry Trumbull. I'm a volunteer. If you want to help us out, just give a call to the phone number. Should be on the screen, 408-998-5865. Last year, we helped 100,000 people with breathing difficulty, 13 different types of breathing disorder. But you should be happy to know that instead, we're going to talk about how do you prevent that today. So I'm going to be talking with Kiely Smith, and we're going to be talking about factory farms, an abomination that only we get away with because nobody knows about it. So she's going to fill you in. See you in 30 seconds.
The different therapeutic methods that we can help our very low socioeconomic status clients who have no alternatives, no anything, and there's still about 15 different resources we got out of this that if you have no resources, no service connection, you can still get aid.
That they are connected, one encourages the other, and that the process of change from backing off from the tobacco is the same as backing off from any other addictive drug.
Everyone can benefit from this training that we just were offered today. I would not take it back.
Welcome back to Breathe California TV. I'm talking with Kiely Smith. So give the formal name of your organization and then we'll start diving into some questions.
So my name is Kiely Smith and I work for Factory Farming Awareness Coalition.
And you want more people to know about factory farms so we can have more of them?
Not exactly. So basically we do education around what factory farming is, some of the impacts of our food choices in our food system, so that it can look like social justice impacts, health impacts, nutrition, and as well as that environmental issues, which is a huge part of both public health component and just, keeping us sustainable in our systems as we exist on Earth.
So talk a little bit about sustainability in factory farms. All of our audience knows about how important it is to eat organically, good food, those kind of things. They hear about those all the time in their lives. But factory farms, probably start with a definition, then I'll do a follow-up.
Sure, yeah. So a factory farm, the way we kind of define this is something like a concentrated animal feeding operation, also known as a CAFO. And this is basically just the process of keeping, tens of thousands of animals confined in a small space. And this is done to maximize the quantity of the product. And it has all kinds of impacts, right? So when you keep animals confined and, in the thousands, there are animal welfare issues related to that as well. And then we have all of these environmental issues that come from having so many, of just having a huge amount of product in one small area.
So when I drive to LA on I-5, I usually stop at a restaurant on the way, and there's an enormous factory farm across the street, and I'm actually astounded with myself and others because it's so smelly. So what kind of air pollution problems do we have?
Yeah, so there's a lot of emissions coming out of factory farms. Ammonia is huge from, I know, chicken factory farms. And then from cattle down on I-5, that's usually, methane, nitrous oxide, and tons of carbon dioxide as well.
So methane is both the worst possible climate change emission, which is part of our air quality problem, but it's a pretty serious problem in terms of the nitrogen and it impacting our lungs too.
Yeah, I don't know the specifics about lung impacts, but I know that, people who live near our factory farms have, which also we need to think about is primarily going to be low-income people and people of color, right? And so people who do live near factory farms have health issues, especially in the areas of respiratory disease, asthma, bronchitis, all kinds of illnesses that come from that, yeah.
So Governor Newsom recently did a State of the State speech with 1 million people drinking unhealthy water, and they're predominantly in the San Joaquin Valley. Are we disposing of those wastes properly from factory farms?
Yeah, so one of the biggest and most obvious, I think, effects of the factory farming system is that we have a huge amount of waste coming from these animals. So, and when we think about the animals in the U.S., this is about 9 billion animals, land animals in the U.S. alone. And so, and we have a huge, a very high rate of animal products demand in this country. So we have one of the higher rates of animals that exist. So all of those animals create a huge amount of waste. And basically what usually is happening with that waste is that it's all being collected in giant pools nearby that, factory farm.
So let's be clear about these pools too. I used to be the regulator of the state's landfills, and the only landfills, pools, things like that are exempt is agriculture.
Yeah.
So are they lined or any protection against what happens in groundwater or if they break?
That I don't know specifically about groundwater, but there are so many protections that these factory farms are exempt from. So one being the Clean Air Act, for example. So really what this means when we provide them with these exemptions is that they're not even required to report any information. And so we don't even know really the emissions coming out of any specific farm. So we have no way to regulate them when that's happening, right? And yeah, so they're being exempt from these laws with water in particular, all of that waste. So, and keeping in mind that this is very toxic stuff, right? So what's coming out of these farms is waste with all kinds of antibiotics and steroids and, dead animals, obviously feces, bacteria. Yeah. And so that is then just sitting in these pools, cesspools, and it really ends up in our water system. So it ends up in, the surrounding
either
rivers
runoff or
runoff. Yeah, exactly. Anywhere in the water system is not going to be good for us, obviously, and that's polluting people's water. And then realistically, it ends up in the ocean. So we have, in our freshwater systems, which we already have very little of, so we do need to protect, we're seeing, what's known as dead zones. Well, this is in the ocean, I guess, the terminology, but basically you have a lot of spots in our water system where there's not enough oxygen for life to exist. And so,
So let's start that all over again.
Yeah.
Because I hadn't thought when you and I were talking about you being on the show, but it's critical for people to understand dead zones. And it seems like every major river in the world has them, and the worst is the Mississippi River. So start with the fertilizer or whatever technique it is at a factory farm that gets into the water, and then translate that into what happens when it goes to the ocean.
Well, I mean, so once you have a pool of waste, of animal waste, okay, so I guess first, usually what people go to is they typically think, okay, well, we can use this to fertilize our crops, right? This is kind of one common thing that comes up. But the problem is that we just have so much of this waste, and it's really toxic. So if we do use it for fertilizer, actually sometimes that's how we have disease breakouts in lettuce or something like that. But so when it's just sitting there and it ends up in the water, something like bacteria loves to eat animal waste, right? So you can have, I should say algae. Obviously bacteria, but algae likes to eat that stuff. So you then get a lot of growth of algae in our water, like our fresh water, and then you have eutrophication and oxidized water.
So just so our audience knows,
yeah,
we've been talking about dead zones in the ocean, but again, you've done a great job of reminding me things. When I worked for EPA, everybody was aghast that Lake Tahoe
Yeah.
was getting serious algae problems when it had been as clear as anything could
Right.
be. And my understanding is by putting constraints on the amount of water pollution that reaches, that we are at least staying even. But finish with what happens in the ocean. So you've got the flow that's being allowed, I would contend illegally, because I don't think the Clean Water Act allows it,
Right.
to go to the ocean, and then algae's growing. So far, what's the matter with that?
Yeah, so once all that waste makes it down to the ocean, we have, like, for example, in the Gulf of Mexico, enormous oceanic dead zones. And so what that looks like is just these whole zones of within, the Gulf, I don't know exactly like mileage, but in the thousands of miles, where life can't exist, and that's just because there's too much pollution and waste, that there's not enough oxygen. And so that's, there are many things that are causing, including like overfishing, death of wildlife in the ocean, but that's another huge consequence of that.
So the one on the Mississippi River runs into the state of Mississippi 100 miles, and 100 miles into Texas, and is 50 miles out from the mouth of the river. So to summarize, there ain't any fish there.
Yeah.
So it's pretty scary stuff. So the contention that I would make is, I was the original manager of the nation's clean air and clean water regulations back in the early 70s. And the laws required factory farms to be treated as stationary sources. So I suspect, but correct me, that you're talking about regulations. And what I've seen is that the switch from one party to another, typically Democrats, stepping in to control factory farms, and then those regulations immediately thrown out when the parties switch, and never getting far enough into it. So we're just about time for another break, so I think we'll go there. We're talking about factory farms, the way industrial farms are able to produce food for us, but with an awful lot of consequences. We'll be back in 30 seconds for more.
The different therapeutic methods that we can help our very low socioeconomic status clients who have no alternatives, no anything, and there's still about 15 different resources we got out of this, that if you have no resources, no service connection, you can still get aid.
That they are connected, one encourages the other, and that the process of change from backing off from the tobacco is the same as backing off from any other addictive drug.
Everyone can benefit from this training that we just were offered today. I would not take it back.
Welcome back. This is Breathe California TV. I'm Terry Trumbull, and we're talking about factory farms. Some of you may be wondering what in the heck farming like this, where we jam a whole bunch of cows or other animals together that really ought to be out grazing, what impact does it have on our air quality that hurts our breathing? Well, the worst area of the country for doing this is the San Joaquin Valley, which has the worst air quality in the world. So that's a starter, but you got an addendum that, since you're much more of an expert on this than me, talk about the air quality problems.
Yeah, so I think when I think air quality now, what I usually go to is the issue of climate change. And so the emissions coming from factory farms have a huge impact on our climate and our air because of the pollution that's coming out of them. And so when you look at the climate change potential of animal agriculture, and actually how much emissions are coming from animal agriculture, it's actually more than the whole transportation sector combined when we look at greenhouse gas emissions.
We even had a president who said that, Ronald Reagan.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
He said, methane from cows needs to be controlled. It's our
Yeah.
worst air quality.
Yeah, exactly. And so, when we have emissions of methane, which is something like 20 times stronger than carbon dioxide in the greenhouse gas, in the greenhouse gas impact, and nitrous oxide, which is something that's 300 times as strong as carbon dioxide. So, carbon dioxide being what's coming out of your cars or trucks. And so if we were to look at actually the impact of, people reducing their meat consumption. So in this country, because we have such a high consumption of these products, we have a huge amount of these animals. And so if we look at, say, reducing, our meat consumption 1 day a week, for example, of no meat or cheese, right? That would be the equivalent in terms of greenhouse gas reductions of taking actually 7.6 million cars off the road instantly. So, I think when we think about what we can do from a personal standpoint too, we all want to make an impact. Nobody wants climate change. And so when we do think about reducing our consumption, even just as consumers, that actually does make a big impact too.
So I want to come back to that, but as I
Sure.
told you, we had a ballot proposition that would treat the animals more humanely that are jammed into these factory farms. So talk about that, and how much did that change things?
Yeah, so when we think about animals being on factory farms, it's actually about 99% of the animals that we have in this country are farmed on these concentrated animal feeding operations. So this is huge, right? And it means that from an animal welfare perspective, there's very low quality of life. Animals are typically confined in really tight spaces. So in California, we passed Proposition 12 on the recent ballot. And this initiative was increasing the size, I believe, only for egg-laying fowl, and I think chicken for meat as well, and then pork, maybe not for meat, sorry, I'm not exactly sure, but pork and cattle, or veal actually. But it basically just increased the space for those animals. So, but when we think about what's actually on the ballot, it's something like, guaranteeing that egg-laying chickens have 1 foot by 1 foot of space. And so,
The scary thing is before then,
exactly. Yeah,
a lot
it
of
makes
places
you think,
gave
what
it
was
less.
it before? Yeah.
I don't want to say the number because I'm not sure it was right, but I told my students talking about factory farms recently, and they were aghast at a number so small.
Exactly, right.
And
that's
to
what
think
we
they
have
were
to-
using and getting even less.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So,
So
but
this
it's-
hasn't changed then the problems with factory farms.
Well, yeah, so we can pass laws like this. And I mean, from an animal welfare perspective, I would say 1 foot by 1 foot is probably better than less than 1 foot by 1 foot. So I'm fully a proponent of passing something like Proposition 12. And luckily, when California passes propositions like this, other states start to catch on. So it could potentially, at least throw a little banana peel in the road for those giant corporations to, make their practices slightly better. But from, a perspective of really changing the industries as a whole and just really changing the system, it's not really doing that, right? So we're still going to have, the corporations, as long as they're making money off of it, they're still going to be pushing the boundaries of whatever, laws we have out there.
Or even getting some politicians to exempt them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, as things have been going so far. So they just have a huge power as lobbying and huge corporations that they are.
So as an alternative, you suggested not eating meat. And there's some people that are going to have problems with that. Is, with organic, which is a long ways from the same thing, and other better ways of producing food, we've been able to educate and make a big difference. Is there any type of certification or can you trust all of the designations that say things like free range?
Yeah, so this is a really good question. Another alternative, like for that usually gets brought up, is grass-fed beef. This is kind of one of these new ones. So something like organic does speak to no antibiotics or pesticides. So that can be beneficial, but it doesn't necessarily. It certainly doesn't speak actually to the quality of life for the animals or anything like that. If you're interested in that, and something like natural actually has no legal definition. So you do want to make sure, on your food labels that you're looking up what the legal definition of each label is and if they're actually regulated by the USDA. And
even there, do you trust USDA all that much?
I mean, as long as there's a legal definition, at least you can make an educated consumer choice. But so when you do think about those, humanely raised animals or sustainably raised meat, it can be beneficial as sort of a means of transitioning. But the only problem with, something like grass-fed beef, when we think about the sheer scale of numbers, so if we were to have 9 billion animals, which we do have, and switch those all to grass-fed, we wouldn't have enough land to even have that be possible. And so that's not actually on the scale, it's not possible. So we do have to scale it back, but it is possible to have, a much smaller scale of animal product and a higher amount of, vegetables and fruits and what have you, which, by the way, would be a lot healthier than the standard American diet anyway. Yeah. So it really comes down to the numbers. If you want to switch to, grass-fed beef or something like that, I think that would be better. But in terms of, guaranteeing really where it came from or what the farm looked like, I really can't tell you that it didn't come from a factory farm when you consider that, 99% of the animals now in the US that are raised for these products are coming from factory farms.
So I teach environmental law, and the biggest lesson I want my students to learn is a law or regulation doesn't mean anything if it's not enforced. And saying something's free range or natural is a better example doesn't mean a thing if there isn't some sort of standard.
Exactly.
But I want to switch to something that may be catching you off guard. With Deng Xiaoping switching to capitalism as the Chinese economy in 1982, far more laissez-faire, true capitalism with almost no regulations. One of the side effects of people getting richer there has been they've switched to eating meat galore. So how much of our factory farms is shipping stuff off to China and other areas that are developing?
Yeah, I don't know the exact numbers in terms of our exports, but I mean, as we see countries getting wealthier, the meat intake goes up. That's a pattern. So in the U.S., we have an incredibly high meat intake, obviously, and then places like China their meat intake is shooting up. So I know their pork especially is which is a hugely environmental. When we think of the environmental footprint of animal products, it's usually beef and pork that are the highest, and lamb, and so that's going to have, with the sheer number of people, obviously the scale could increase like crazy. So I would hope that we're able to curb it somehow, but with exactly like you say, with a capitalistic society, that's just the way things go when you want more product and you have a high demand.
Yeah, all of this is pretty significant. As you were talking, I was reminded that we are sending more alfalfa than we're using in America from California, and so they may very well be using that to go beef or pork or whatever it is in China based on that. And that's just sheer insanity to ship all over water to go crop in a desert. Yeah. And then ship it, no matter how efficient ships might be, to have something else. So talk a little bit about the education aspects to what you're trying to do. It basically is the whole reason for the organization.
Yeah, so with Factory Farming Awareness Coalition, we've found kind of an area that wasn't being filled, which is just educating the public. So, nobody wants factory farming. That's what I always say. It's like, there's not going to be anyone, a member of the public who, you know, even the most meatiest of meat lovers that loves animal products, they don't really want their animals to be raised in these conditions, and they don't, you know, nobody wants any of these effects that we've seen, or that once we learn about it is when people are outraged or they have an opinion. But right now, it's not something that's talked about. So this is kind of the mission of our organization, is just really getting the message out there to people where our food's coming from. And then, you know, you all can take it from there, what kind of, either if you want to change your consumer choices based on this, or, you know, look more into, you know, some of these other technological solutions, such as clean meat, which is a new idea, and plant-based meat products that are coming out now. So there's a lot happening, especially here in the Bay Area, around some of the technology too that could address this issue. Yeah.
So I'm kind of startled just because of what you mentioned to me.
Yeah.
I am religious in watching Warriors games.
Okay.
And I think it's Burger King has been advertising like
Carl's
crazy.
Jr. maybe?
It might be, but it's a vegetable hamburger, and there's no reason you can't make the taste the same.
Yeah, so this is a huge movement here with food scientists that are, especially in the Bay Area, but they're coming up with all of these different, so, you know, before it was like tofurkey, and they would just have, you know, a soy-based product, and it wasn't really very good, but whatever, it was something for vegans to eat at the Thanksgiving or whatever. But now, you know, they're really getting into how can we address this for people who do want to eat meat. You know, we all love the taste of meat, but they want to have it be more sustainable and something that can physically sustain the human population, basically. So they're coming up with all these different substitute products based on plants. So, you know, different kinds of legume proteins. They're even making it bleed like meat using like beet juice and things like this to substitute.
So I've got to interrupt you because we got about a minute left.
Okay.
But I assume you would urge people to try these vegetable alternatives.
Sure.
You don't necessarily have to just reduce your meat use, but you have other alternatives. So we have about 30 seconds left. What's the takeaway message from an organization that's all about education?
Yeah, so I think the main takeaway is really just educate yourself about where your food is coming from, and then make conscious consumer decisions, you know, as best to your ability to either reduce your meat intake, which really is going to be the end-all be-all of solutions, I think, and then look into these other products, you know, if you want to look into clean meat or plant-based products.
So we've been talking about the evils associated with factory farms. We'll hopefully have a show just as good for you next week. See you then.